We're glad you're here. Again, the real purpose, so I want to emphasize this, is take some of these pearls of wisdom and use them. And again, I can't thank all of y'all enough, because if you look around this room, what you see are a bunch of activists. Folks who've cared about this country, cared about this state, and who've tried to make a difference on that front. And the purpose is, again, to visit a little bit, take a few tools home, and use them. Thanks again for being here. So that I don't cut into your time, Russ Sobel.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm always very thrilled to come back to my home state of South Carolina. I miss it a whole lot. I'm up in West Virginia now, and it's odd being an economist up in West Virginia, because we're a very impoverished state, despite the fact that we have probably the most abundant supply of natural resources in the country under our soil. Which is a good way to motivate my presentation today. It's based on a book that we just came out with this past year with some policy ideas for how to unleash capitalism and promote growth here in South Carolina. The book has been published by the South Carolina Policy Council, and it's based on a book I wrote very similarly for West Virginia 3 years ago that's had a huge impact up in that state. Now, I know not all of you can see the PowerPoint, and I promise I'll do a very good job of just talking about what's on the slide, so don't worry about it if you can't see it. I would like to start out, though, with what is my very favorite picture. So if you can get a glimpse of this one, you might want to. It's a satellite photo of the Earth at night. And you know, when we look around the globe, what you can see is that there's some places that are bright and shining with prosperity and wealth. And then sadly, there's other places on the face of the Earth that are dark. They remain dim and impoverished. And for 200 years, what economics, the science of economics, has been about is about trying to explain what creates these differences. The father of economics, Adam Smith, the very first economist, wrote the very first economics book. The title of it, everybody calls it The Wealth of Nations, but the full title was An Inquiry into the Nature and Causes of the Wealth of Nations. And in that book in 1776, Adam Smith set out to try to understand what was the secret to economic growth and prosperity. And after 200 years of scientific research looking at data from the states, from the countries of the world, economists now firmly believe that Adam Smith's conclusion that he wrote over 200 years ago is spot on the money. And that is, it's really the policies and the system of economic organization that you have that matters for prosperity, not things like your climate, your geography, or your resources. You know, some people would say, oh, places that grow rich are just those who stumble on a wonderful piece of land with great resources. But we look around the world, we see West Virginia, we see Argentina and Venezuela, both with abundant resources that aren't growing. And yet we see miracles like Hong Kong and Japan that are volcanic islands out in the middle of the ocean with no natural resources to speak of, that have grown to be as rich as the major industrial countries of the world. The reason why, and the most important thing to understand, is how an economist views the whole economy, is that every economy starts out with some inputs, some resources to work with, and then tries to turn them into the economic outcomes: growth, job creation, new businesses, entrepreneurship. But what's in the middle is the rules of the game, or the government policies. And the best analogy I can give you for this is the process of baking cookies and cakes. You know, you start out with some ingredients, you put them in the oven, and then out the other end comes delicious, yummy cakes and cookies. And here's the problem. Too many governments in the world try to foster economic growth by shoveling more ingredients in the oven, when the problem is not an ingredients problem at all. It's an oven problem. Because if the oven isn't working, you can keep shoveling ingredients into it all day long, and you get nothing out the other end. The problem in places like West Virginia, which has gone from a middle-income state 50 years ago, Charleston, West Virginia was the size of Charlotte, North Carolina, same population per capita income. West Virginia has impoverished itself because it cannot get its policies right. Here's a great example from West Virginia. 30 years ago, we had the most expensive road construction project in the nation undertaken in West Virginia. Route 50, they took a 2-lane road and made it into this big 4-lane divided road going halfway across the state. At the time, they justified this massive increase in government spending by saying it would create a path of economic development across our state. Well, the politicians put signs up letting you know who gave them the money to build the road. And here's what it looks like driving down the road today. I mean, it's a cell phone picture out my front window. You can't see it, but there's 4 lanes of nothing is what it is. 30 years it's been there. Not only is there no path of economic development, it takes 2 hours to get from one end of this road to the other. There's only 1 gas station on this whole road for 2 hours. I hear with the stimulus money, they're making it 6 lanes so that they can promote economic growth. The problem is there was no trucks on that road 30 years ago. There's no trucks on that road today, and you can't get there by spending more money. Shoveling ingredients into the oven doesn't work. Problem is we need a better business climate so we have businesses who can employ these resources in a productive way. The best example on the Earth at Night photo is North and South Korea. If you look at the difference in their prosperity, it's all due to policy. North Korea has a standard of living of Africa, while South Korea has a standard of living almost as high as West Virginia's. They have the same culture, the same climate, the same geography. They used to be the same country. They have a common history. Every bit of this difference is due to the difference in their economic policies. South Korea ranks among the top 20 most free market economies in the world, while North Korea ranks as one of the most capitalist, unfriendly countries on the face of the globe. That's how much of a difference policies make. Now, let me give you just some quick facts on South Carolina. I'm going to breeze through these quick because I would like to get to some policy suggestions for how to help increase economic growth and prosperity in South Carolina. If you look at South Carolina, it currently ranks 45th in per capita income. Not very far ahead of West Virginia, which is very sad because growing up here I know all the beautiful ports and harbors, the climate and the beautiful things you have going on here. How can it be that South Carolina is 45th in the income rankings? What you may not know is it hasn't always been that way. They've been keeping this data since 1929, and here's South Carolina's history in terms of its per capita income ranking. South Carolina was pretty much the poorest state in the nation at the beginning of the sample. Out of the 48 states, it was 48th in 1929. In fact, as recently as 1979, when I was here as a youngster growing up, South Carolina was ranked 48th in per capita income. But what happened during the 1980s is that South Carolina went on a growth spurt. And it grew very rapidly and moved up 11 spots in the national income rankings, so that by the late 1980s, South Carolina was 38th in per capita income. Had that trend continued, you'd be the 14th richest state in the country today. But instead, what has happened is we've gone backwards, and South Carolina has now fallen back to 45th in the income rankings. The reason is obvious when you look at the data. It's a growth problem. During the 80s, South Carolina was growing in terms of inflation-adjusted average standard of living at 2.2%. And as you can see, the growth has fallen off. And by the 2000s, the average is less than 1% economic growth. What this has meant is that 20 years ago, the average family in South Carolina, this average per person, was about equally as rich as the average resident in Oklahoma and South Dakota. But today, if you look, the average residents in South Dakota and Oklahoma are about $5,000 richer than the average person in South Carolina. That difference has manifested itself just in 20 years, and it's all a growth issue. South Dakota has been able to sustain the 2.1% growth. Oklahoma 1.8, South Carolina only 1.2 over that period. It's pretty clear that South Carolina's future is all dependent on how rapidly it can get private sector economic growth. The future, if we keep growing at 1.2%, is here. But if we could go back up to 1.7 or 2.2% growth during the 1980s, you can see that 1 or 2 generations out, the difference in the standard of living is phenomenal. So how can South Carolina get more economic growth? Let me give you some policy suggestions. The first thing you can do is try to better reward productive activities by lowering taxes and regulations on productive activities. The 2 most important resources that you have to work with are capital and labor. And you need tax reform that can help them be more productive. The first, let's talk a little bit about capital investment. This is a feller buncher used in the timber industry. With one of these, loggers are about 5 times as productive as they are with a chainsaw. And they make 5.5 times as much per hour operating one of these machines. These machines, though, cost $1 million. Capital investment is very expensive. But capital investment is what drives labor productivity and wage growth in the state. Problem is, too many states, West Virginia and South Carolina alike, tax capital investment way too heavily. In fact, according to the National Association of Manufacturers, if you look at the average property tax on machinery and equipment bill for a manufacturer earning with $25 million in assets, South Carolina is at the top of their list. They would pay about $2 million a year in property taxes here. Across the border in Georgia, it's half that. Across the border in North Carolina, it's only a quarter of that. By taxing capital investment so heavily, you lower the amount of capital in your state, and the current businesses keep their capital longer and have older equipment than they should. By lowering the taxation on capital investment, you can increase economic growth. Second, in terms of the labor force and the personal income tax, in 1959, South Carolina's income tax had 6 brackets, starting at 0 and going up where the top tax bracket of 7% began at an income of $10,000. That made sense back then because the average family only earned $3,800 back in '59, so they were in the 3% bracket. Well, what's happened since 1959 is we've had a little bit of inflation. The problem is the South Carolina tax code hasn't kept up with it. Here's today's tax code for the personal income tax in South Carolina. The top tax bracket starts at $13,500. Virtually the only state in the nation where a family that would classify under the federal poverty guidelines, which would be about $20,000 for a family of 2 or 3, would fall into the top tax bracket. Your top tax rate isn't out of line with other states. It's the rate at which it begins, the income at which it begins that's the problem. Had the tax code in 1959 simply been updated for inflation, the top tax bracket would start at about $75,000, which is about what it starts at in most other states. West Virginia, for example, is $60,000 where our top tax bracket kicks in. Same in North Carolina. And in fact, if we updated the personal income tax code in South Carolina for inflation, the average family in South Carolina would move to the 4% bracket rather than being in the top tax bracket. Essentially what you have is the highest rate flat income tax in the nation because virtually everybody here is in the top tax bracket. By lowering these taxes, you could promote entrepreneurial activity and investment. We need to discourage unproductive uses of resources in the economy, and that's as equally as important as promoting productive resources. One of the best things, as an example that I want to talk about, is the use of targeted tax credits and subsidies. Generally, pro-business people are all in favor of those, but free market economists aren't. The reason why is because tax credits and favoritism result in a lot of the state's resources being directed at lobbying the state capital. And when people spend their time and talents doing that, we give up the things that they could be doing elsewhere. In West Virginia, we have a sales tax exemption for Girl Scout cookies. That got there because the Girl Scouts spent 4 days camping out at our state capitol lobbying the state legislature. Now, I don't blame the state legislature. I couldn't have said no to the Girl Scouts either. But here's the 2 things to draw from that example. First, when the Girl Scouts spend 4 days lobbying our legislature, they give up 4 days of doing other productive things they could have done. What could they have done for 4 days that would have created wealth? Sold the cookies, helped old ladies across the road, learned to do camp, I don't know. But the point 2 of it is this, is that I was giving my speech in West Virginia and I said, you know, it's so unfair because the Boy Scouts came to my house this past Christmas selling wreaths. I bought one, I had to pay sales tax. Well, funny enough, after my presentation, the head of the West Virginia Boy Scouts just happened to be in the audience. He comes up and said, well, guess what? We're planning to do Boy Scout days at the legislature next year and trying to get ours. So what happens when you deal out all these special favors is that everybody has to spend their time and talents lobbying rather than in their business or in their profession working. If you're going to do things, they need to be broad-based. For example, a broad-based exemption for all youth nonprofits at once would have taken care of that problem and not devoted as many resources towards lobbying. Number 3, you need to quit trying to centrally plan the economy. The economy is a process of discovery, and that discovery is led by individuals. In fact, crazy individuals who you would never believe would make it. Some of the best examples of what I'm talking about. Ken Olsen, who was president and founder of Digital Equipment Corp in the 1970s. He was the equivalent of Bill Gates back then. Digital Equipment Corp was one of the first big computer makers. 1977, interview in Popular Mechanics magazine, he says, there's no reason anybody would ever want a computer in their home. How could he be so wrong? Well, what did computers look like in 1977? They were the size of this room, and they crunched numbers. Do you want one of those in your home? No. But not even the people in the computer industry, at the forefront of that industry, could see what was coming. It turns into this laptop where you can, surf the web, check the weather, meet your potential spouse, view explicit material. Who would have possibly foreseen that? Nobody. Not even the people in the industry could plan that industry's future. A better story is Fred Smith, the founder and CEO of FedEx. He was in undergraduate college at Yale, not a bad place. His capstone senior business course was led by the nation's, his professor was the nation's leading expert on business plan evaluation. In fact, his professor would be the kind of guy that you'd bring in to centrally plan your economy. Give us cluster advice or whatever, right? Well, anyway, to this day, Fred Smith still, you know, so anyway, long story short is, for that class, they had to write up a business plan. Fred Smith goes back to his dorm room, comes up with the idea for FedEx, writes it, turns it in for the class. Here's what his professor wrote on it and read in. The concept's interesting and well-formed, but in order to earn better than a C, the idea must be feasible. They've interviewed his professor. His professor said, look, you've got to understand, at the time Fred Smith turned this in, our federal government had been operating the U.S. Postal Service for almost 200 years. They don't even have to run into profit. They can use tax money. They have an office in every city in America, a distribution network set up. They can't even deliver packages across the country overnight. And here I've got this undergraduate student who was probably staying out too late drinking last night, turning in this idea. There's no way he can do this. And yet he does. Now, here's one you will want to look at. Would you invest in that group of people? You might recognize the guy in the lower left. That's Bill Gates. That's Microsoft's first company photo. You may have heard that if you invested early on that you'd be rich with Microsoft. It's true. The irony is they had very hard time raising capital. People wouldn't give them money. So normally when you give a group of hippies like this money, they run off and do drugs with it. Run off and change the way we live. Now you tell me how a government can centrally plan this. They can't. The way a government can help promote this stuff is by staying out of the way of crazy individuals. I would have time to do this for South Carolina, so it's one left over from West Virginia. There's a gas station I stop at all the time to use the restroom, and I'm traveling around the state to use the restroom. And here are the number of permits on the wall at that gas station. There's 13 of them. Now, maybe I need to clarify they don't do open heart surgeries there. It's a gas station, right? But this kills small mom and pop entrepreneurs. You've got to have a legal department, a tax staff to deal with this stuff. So in a place like West Virginia, yeah, we have Targets and Walmarts, but the small mom and pop entrepreneurs are gone. They cannot navigate this process. And that's a shame because it's the small, crazy idea people who really discover the future for a state. Number 4. We've got to reduce government size, growth, and centralization. The goal should be to reduce the share of the economy that's controlled by the government. In South Carolina, for example, currently 40% of this economy is government spending if you include all government spending, federal, state, and local. If you just, well, I'll give you some data on that in a minute. But the goal has got to be to reduce that. Really, the hard part is, of course, cutting spending because there's always groups who get benefits from it and they fight against the cuts. That's why the most important thing has got to be restraining the growth of new programs through a tax and expenditure limit law, which South Carolina has a constitutional one. It's just not very strong, and in fact has allowed South Carolina's government to grow massively. This is currently the size of all government in South Carolina, the 10th highest in the nation. Government spending as a percent of the economy. And if you just look at state and local, it's the 11th highest in the U.S. And that's a shame because during the 1980s when growth was 2.2%, South Carolina's government sector fell by 5% of the economy. It's grown by 10% of the economy since. And you've seen what's happened to economic growth. The best estimates from the economics profession and our economics literature suggest that for every 10% of the economy a government grows, it reduces economic growth by about 1 percentage point. The irony is, you apply that to South Carolina, it's almost dead on. Government's grown about 10% of the economy, economic growth's fallen by a little over a percentage point. Dead on. Finally, government can be made more effective by decentralizing. The different parts of the state are different, and we need to empower local governments who are more competitive to do more. Currently, South Carolina is the 14th most centralized state, and the evidence is clear from the economics literature that decentralization and shifting spending and tax authority to local governments is the path to economic performance. Finally, in conclusion, the other thing is to impose checks on the regulatory environment and increase the security of property rights. Now, since I have 3 minutes left, You know, I'm used to teaching undergraduate students with beer examples, so excuse me, that's the only good examples I got. So, you know, property rights, the quickest I can tell my students about why those matters, I say, I bet I can guess what's in your refrigerator back at your dorm room or your apartment. Nothing. Same thing as I had in my refrigerator when I was in college. And it's not that I didn't want it stocked full of pizza and drinks and stuff like that. Problem was, if I went to the grocery store, bought all that stuff, stuck it in there, went off to class, came back, opened the refrigerator, it was all gone. Because my roommates just took it all. And you know, the problem with insecure property rights is that nobody will invest. And I tell my kids, the best thing about graduating from college is you get your own refrigerator. And I got a refrigerator sitting back there in West Virginia full of good drinks and eat up buffalo wings and pizzas. And the reason I have it stocked full is because I know that even though I'm down here states away for 2 days, when I get back home, open it up, it's all going to be there. If you want capital investment and people to do things, you have to make sure that their investments are secure. Eminent domain is the biggest threat to that, but I'm not going to go on with that because I want to do the last thing, which is to talk a little bit about regulatory reform. You know, one of the nice things about regulatory reform is, unlike tax cuts, they're not nearly as costly. It's something that can be done with really no new government spending or very minimal outlay. The problem with the regulatory process in government is that there's no natural profit and loss mechanism to weed out bad regulations. See, in the private sector, crazy people are trying ideas all the time. But the problem is that in the private sector, if you stumble on a good one, it continues. If you stumble on a bad one, you go out of business. But all the time we pass all these regulations, then we never subject them to follow-up to see if they're really accomplishing their goals in a cost-effective manner. In West Virginia, for example, they were worried there was too many taxi cab accidents because cab drivers were driving their cabs for too long of a window during the day. Cab drivers usually lease a cab for 24 hours. So what they did is they passed a law saying you can't lease a cab for more than 8.5 hours, which is 15 minutes to return it, 15 minutes to pick it up, and 8 hours a day to drive. The stated intent of that regulation was to reduce cab accidents. If you want to take a guess, we got the data in our West Virginia book. What happens to cab accidents the day that's passed? It doesn't take much of economic logic to follow the incentives. A cab driver used to have 24 hours with their cab. They could go home for lunch, dinner, kids' soccer game, drive during the busy parts of the day. Now you've got your cab for 8 hours and that's it. What do? Take no breaks, drive faster. Cab accidents go. Number of cabs in West Virginia has gone down by 20% as a result of this. So we now have, of course, more drunk driving and all that stuff. But even with 20% fewer cabs on the road, cab accidents, the number has gone up. I mean, this legislation is not even living up to its stated intent, but we can't get it off the books. It's been in my book in West Virginia for 3 years. Talk to the legislators. Why can't you get this fixed? Well, we've got too much other important stuff to deal with. And that's the way it always is. What we need to do is make sure when we pass any new regulation, it builds in a sunset provision that requires that regulation to prove within X period of time, using data, that it's accomplishing its desired outcome, or it automatically goes off the books. Make regulations fight to stay on the books rather than the other way around. We need a systematic way to get bad regulations, costly regulations, off the books. Well, that's what I have, and I'll be happy to take some time for some questions, but let me mention that the books are, through the South Carolina Policy Council, and I was not able to get a bunch of hard copies, but the good news is it's available for free in PDF on the website, unleashingcapitalismsc.org. And so it's up here on the PowerPoint, so if you want to swing by and write it down or whatever, you can get the PDF version of the book for free. And if you're interested in the West Virginia version, please just get in touch with me and I'll be happy to send you a copy of that. Now, Governor,